Marcel. I write the blog Lesser Known Gems, and today I'm going to focus on women in translation. August this month we are celebrating something called Women in Translation, which is about promoting female authors who are translated. And what I really want to know today, with the help of you, is what does that mean? What does it mean that that literature is women in translation for me, who have Norwegian as my mother tongue? I love the idea about promoting female writers, which because female writers has a tendency, at least the broad generalization is that they write more about the home and marriage and family. And it's quite interesting to see how female writers can write about big topics like politics and religion by focusing on the family, which is generally a different way of discussing these topics than broad generalization male authors have a tendency to do. So that's good, we like that. But when I hear the word in translation, and when I read or watch something that talks about translated literature, I get a bit confused. Not necessarily about what it means to be that something is translated. That in itself is kind of obvious. But what does it mean that something is translated literature, or that we should promote translated literature? So a little backstory about me. I'm from Norway. For the people who don't know, Norway is a country here in the northern Europe. This is Europe. And when I was 6 months, so I was about 4.5, we lived here in England due to my father's work. So I learnt both English and Norwegian simultaneously, by English from the people around me, but Norwegian from my parents. So both languages are what's called my first language. But my mother tongue is Norwegian, because that's the language my parents talked. And the official language of the country I've lived mostly in Norway, is Norwegian and Sami. So I'm talking to you as someone who doesn't have English as her mother tongue, which is why when we say we want to promote literature, translated literature, it can become quite complicated, especially when English, which while not everyone is bilingual in the sense that they speak two languages from they were very little, as I did, English is very common in Norway. So everyone speaks English and can read English, and a lot of people do. But when you talk about translated literature, and translated literature in sort of the technical sense, it just means books that have been translated from the language they were originally written. It means that I get more brownie points for reading Drep ikke en sangfugl, because that's translated, the Norwegian translation of To Kill a Mockingbird. So I'm getting more brownie points by reading something that's more distant from the original text, which I easily could do, and most people in Norway easily could do. And I don't think that was the general point of why I want to sort of promote translated literature, but that sort of shows just one aspect of how complicated a term like that can be. And it can even go one step further, because Norwegian is very similar to Swedish and Danish. So if you know Norwegian, you can understand Swedish and Danish. And I read books in Swedish and Danish. And in that sense, reading the Norwegian translation of Tove Jansson, who was a Swedish writing Finn, gives me more brownie points than reading Selma Lagerlöf in the original Swedish. Despite that being the same language the books were originally written in, this is translated, this is not. Am I allowed to promote both of them? That's why I'm sort of getting confused. Is this okay to promote in Women in Translation, but this is not, because this is the original language and original text, despite Swedish not being my mother tongue? Because we could sort of say, well, when we talk about literature translation, it's about the translation process, and it's about reading something that has been translated in and of itself. But let's look at that. If you have English as your mother tongue, and I have Norwegian as my mother tongue, then French would be a foreign language for both of us, whether or not we speak. I don't speak French. I really should, but I don't. So there you, for example, have the French authors like Colette and François Sagan. So both of these are translated from the original French. This one is in Norwegian and this one is in English. If you are English speaking, then I would assume that you would have to read the English translation of French books. So my Norwegian translation of the French books are pretty much worthless if we're going to talk about the translation process. If we're going to talk about the translation, we need to have the same, not necessarily text, but the same language that we're going to discuss, because translating French into English and translating French into Norwegian are two very different things, which is why certain languages are easier to translate into other languages. Pretty much, so it's, for example, easier to translate German into Norwegian than it is to translate German into English, because German and Norwegian are grammatically more similar. So I haven't seen that much discussion about the translating process, or that we need to read the same, translated into the same language. So I assume that it's not the translation in and of itself that's the point with translated literature. So then again, I come back to the question, what does it mean that something is translated? When I read about why this became a thing, why people started to talk about it was important to talk about translated literature, it was based in an Anglo-American focus on how little literature, and especially how little literature written by women, were translated into English. And this is a fairly important point also for me, because I can read and understand English, Norwegian, Swedish and Danish. That's it. So if I want to read any other kind of language, or books written in any other kind of language, I need them to be translated into one of those languages. And if you've been to my blog, you will see that I am now trying to have a project where I want to read through Europe. So I want to read a book from each European country. And I mostly read books that were published before 1956. All of that is explained on the blog. And I thought that, okay, then I can sort of try and focus on the female writers. I want to read female writers because, again, I think they have a different way of writing and presenting very often than their male counterparts. So it's interesting to sort of see how they're presented. And the books are there, the authors are there. Despite what people might think, a lot of women were writing in a a lot of countries where you sort of say, well, women didn't have the right or place to write, and they did. It's not just translated into English or Norwegian or Swedish or Danish. They're translated into Russian or they're translated into German, but because I don't speak Russian or German, that doesn't help me. And I'm not surprised that things aren't translated into Norwegian or Swedish or Danish, because the languages are so small and the countries are so small that it doesn't really make physical sense for having them translated. So I am dependent on them being translated into English if I'm going to have access to these books. So I do understand that it is important to talk about which books are translated into English, because considering English is the lingua franca, all of us that have English as our sort of main second language are dependent on English being available and having English material being available also when it comes to other main languages. So it's not so that in that sense I do agree that this is important to talk about. But again, I'm going to talk about, if I want to talk about books, I want to promote the books I've read that is translated literature, what kind of books do I actually then get to promote? If the idea was to promote books that are translated, that are non-English, that was sort of written in a different language than non-English, would I be allowed to promote Norwegian literature? Could I talk about Sigrid Undset and Amalie Skram, despite me reading them in Norwegian, the original language? They are not translated literature to me, but for everyone else, they would be. That's sort of how translation works, in a sense. And does that count as women in translation in the sort of book community on the internet? Is it generally just about promoting non-English female writers? Or can I only promote books like Sigrid Løvgraff and Tove Hansson, which wrote in a different language than me, but where I still read the original text or can read it in the original language? Or can I only promote books that have been translated but in addition aren't English? So French books are okay, but Norwegian from English translations not okay. I'm not talking about being, I don't mean to be picky. I don't want to sort of have an argument that we shouldn't read translated literature. I'm trying to figure out what is my role as someone who talks about books on the internet, who want to talk about diversity among the books and authors on the internet. What is my role in the term translated literature when English isn't my mother tongue? Let's have a discussion down below. Please help me figure out where I belong, what I can promote, what I shouldn't promote. Read diversely, and remember, it's better to be a witty fool than a foolish wit.